Well, good morning, and welcome to the ring. All right. Thank you all for coming, and thank you all online for tuning in and watching, or if you're watching this later. I'm grateful that a lot of you have stuck with it. I know the material can be a little difficult. It's foreign to a lot of us, and it's just keep from the bottom up in their view. Everything has to be determined because physics isn't actively out there changing different laws. Sure, you can talk about quantum, whatever, but in general, you have fixed, determined natural laws, and then because that's determined, everything that's built on top of it is also determined. So for example, your emotions are something like neurons firing in your brain caused by external stimuli. Obviously, no one thinks about it that way, but if their worldview is true, it can't be anything else. You either have certain spots in your brain lighting up, and that we've placed into certain categories, or it's just sort of some illusion that you've happened to acquire, and which is the next one, that freedom, any sort of freedom, free will that we talk about is something that we evolved, according to naturalism, to facilitate safe and functioning community. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And free will is an important test because it's how we determine moral responsibility. And there's an asterisk by free will because there's a lot of discussion about what free will is and what it means. And a lot of this, especially within Christianity, is kind of an in-house discussion, right? Very important things that we should think about. We should think hard about it. Like, how do you put together the sovereignty of God and human freedom and responsibility, right? But all of that is kind of an aside because what we're dealing with here is deterministic naturalism versus Christianity. Because however you work that out, what free will is within Christianity, we all agree that we make choices, right? You chose what you chose what to wear today, and you thought that it was a morally good choice to come to church, right? There's a lot of freedom that we have, and Christianity makes sense of that. And another quote from Piercy here is that it is ironic that people who reject Christianity, who think that without God they can finally be free, end up with philosophies that deny human freedom. We're going to take a look at that. I've got some quotes there by pretty prominent naturalists of various stripes. And the reason I put a lot of these in here is when you're talking with people, you're wanting to be like, look, these are your guys, right? These are your guys saying what you believe. If you're agreeing with naturalism, here's someone who is brilliant and understands it, and they're saying this is where it leads. Because I don't know about most, but a lot of people who are just kind of everyday folk don't think through the implications of their world. They don't build a worldview out. They just kind of have scattered beliefs. We'll talk about that in a bit. But the first quote there, human beings in their thinking, feeling, and acting are not free, but as causally bound as the stars in their motions. I am compelled to act as if free will existed, because if I wanted to live in a civilized society, I must act responsibly. Einstein, of course, was a genius, right? Famously so. If you know nothing else about him, he was a genius. And so there's a couple things in there, right? The humans are causally bound. So in naturalism, you have a closed system, which means the universe is as it is. It's locked. It's determined. There are laws that govern it, and there's nothing outside. Nothing can be affected or changed. Nothing goes in, nothing goes out. And so cause and effect determines everything, which is easy to see if you're playing pool, right? Cue hits the ball hits another ball, etc. But it's less easy to see when you're talking about human actions. But he's here saying, no. If everything he's talking about is true, then humans are just as causally bound as anything else. But then he backpedals and says, well, I'm compelled to act as if free will is true because he wants to live in a civilized society and he has to act responsibly. To which I'm wondering, why? Why does that matter to you? But the key phrase here is as if. You have to act as if it's free, or as if it's real, even though you know it's not. So you're taking a leap of faith and saying, well, look, my view says that's wrong, but life is unlivable, so I have to believe that. And so the phrase as if something is true is something to watch out for as well. And the next quote by your old pal, Richard Dawkins, says, humans are merely survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed. When a computer malfunctions, we do not punish it. We track down the problem and fix it. And then he's referring to reforming the entire criminal justice system. So that isn't the murderer or the rapist just a machine with a defective component? I'll pause there for a minute. Think about how that works out, right? If naturalism is true and you're all just causally bound and pre-programmed to do whatever it is you do, then why not murder? Why not rape? After all, you had no free will choice in the matter, and you're just a defective component. Now he's referencing Fawlty Towers. Just as a quick show of hands, who knows what Fawlty Towers is? Good. Okay, good. Old British comedy, John Cleese, Monty Python, right? He had another show where him and his wife were managing this hotel and hilarity ensues. Well, this particular scene he's talking about is he's got this car, and of course he's in the middle of wild craziness. He has to run back and get all this stuff or whatever. But anyway, he's going and there's traffic, so he has to turn back around, and his car stops right on a sidewalk, and he upset, this has been building and building and building, and he gets upset, and he starts yelling at the car, he starts threatening the car, he starts warning the car, says he's going to count to 3, and then it doesn't work, and so he's like, fine, I'm going to give you a good thrashing, and he exits the frame and comes back with this big leafy stick, and he's beating it and beating it. And so to that end, he said Dawkins says, of course we laugh, but why don't we laugh at a judge who punishes a criminal? Doesn't a truly scientific, mechanistic view of the nervous system make nonsense of the very idea of responsibility? And then someone asked him, well, don't you see that that's an inconsistency in your view? And he said, well, I sort of do, yes, but it is an inconsistency that we sort of have to live with. Otherwise, life would be intolerable. And it's kind of a stunning admission, because you're going, well, you really don't have to live with this sort of inconsistency. There's a worldview out there that makes sense of this, but he's unwilling to take that step, right? But if you're taking everything else he says there seriously, why, to point to recent events over in Louisville, right? There was a lot of emotion, we'll say, when the results for Breonna Taylor came out. Well, if materialism is right, why would any of those officers get punished? Right? I mean, if they were just pre-programmed, nothing wrong happened, especially if you kind of take morality if you're a naturalist, into the upper story, nothing wrong happened in the first place. So they're living out a belief, they're acting out in beliefs that are contrary to what they're talking about. And so, yes, there's an inconsistency, but otherwise life would be intolerable. It's another phrase like the live as if it existed. And then finally, there's a philosopher, Edward Slingerland, who said there may well be individuals who lack this sense and who can quite easily and thoroughly conceive of themselves and other people in purely instrumental, mechanistic terms, But we label such people psychopaths and quite rightly try to identify them and put them away somewhere to protect the rest of us. And you're like, yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense, but it only makes sense if Christianity is the correct worldview. If naturalism, as he would ascribe to, is the correct worldview, then it doesn't make sense. There's no such thing as a psychopath. That is a meaningless term. Why would you put people away? That protection from what? Why? It doesn't make any sense. Their view does not take it into consideration. And it just drives home what Romans tells us, right? They became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Another quote by Piercy, it says, "The secular project leads to the suicide of the intellect and the disintegration of the person. By contrast, the Christian worldview is amazingly positive, affirming both the unity of truth and the holistic commitment of the thinking person." Now, that crafting of that phrase is particular and helpful for a reason, right? You'll notice it's amazingly positive, right? Christianity is generally viewed as negative, but we have a high view of freedom. We have a high view of the value of people. We have the high view of morals. In fact, we end up having a high view of things that the people you talk to already hold dear. They can't explain it on their own view, but we can. And that's part of what we're trying to do. And especially the fifth week when we put Christianity forward as an alternative. But yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very true. So Andy brought out that defective computer, defective component, defective by what standard? Maybe that's exactly what it's supposed to be, and it's not a defective standard. And that's exactly right. You'll, kind of going off on that idea, you'll have particular atheistic type views. If you try and put forward, the design argument, right, for the existence of God. If you're saying, look, the nature and the cosmos and us, there's evidence of design, and we can show how. A lot of times, a common response to that is, well, there's defective design, right? This is bad design, and okay, well, to use that same question, by what standard, right? How do you know this is a defective design? Defective is a moral phrase. And if morality is essentially an illusion that you've evolved to live peaceably in your society, then on what grounds are you saying there's defective design, and why is that bad? And we'll get into that. But the other term, so Piercy talks about the holistic commitment. Holistic is a generally positive word, especially today, and Christianity makes sense of all that. We have the whole picture, and you can have a holistic commitment to truth and to understanding and values and morality and all these things. So it's helpful to stress that. Said that the God who exists is personal and has ultimate freedom. We are made in his image. It would make sense that we would have a degree of freedom as well. Naturalism, atheism, secularism, they all have us evolving up from lower creatures, which are impersonal and instinctual, but governed strictly by the laws of physics. In other words, if you evolve up from lower animals and then from single-celled organisms, etc., even discounting the problem of where did all of that start, how did it come from, even discounting that, you have to go, well, our idea of freedom had to come from non-freedom. Our idea of personality, personhood, had to come from non-personal creatures. So how is that happening? And freedom is as kind of those guys illustrated, it's nothing but an illusion. But the Bible all over the place has freedom as a basis for moral responsibility, right from the very beginning. God, do whatever you want, but don't eat of that tree. And they did. And they were responsible because they were told not to, and they did. Or, fast forward, choose this day whom you would serve. Choose, or choose to repent. Or, I have put before you death and life, choose life. Over and over and over again, the Bible says you're responsible morally because you have freedom in that matter. Now, especially in terms of salvation, we know that God is the one who's acting first, right? So I don't want to throw that out. But there are genuine choices and things that people make, and a degree of freedom is necessary for that to make any sense. And so before moving on to postmodernism, does anyone have any questions? Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, in naturalism, is there any legitimate moral judgment at all? And I think they're hoping that people don't pay attention to that, right? So everyone instinctively knows, now we would say it's because we're made in God's image, we have God's law written on our hearts, we are without excuse, etc., but we all know that morality actually exists. We all know that moral judgments happen, we make them all the time. The naturalist is just sort of trading off the fact that we do it and not bothering to explain why or how. And as some of these more honest guys are saying, yeah, it's an illusion. It's a social construct, if you will, but it's something we have to work with. We have to work as if it's true because we want society. So yeah, it's definitely an inconsistency. It doesn't match reality, and we have to kind of use our questions to gently and lovingly point that out. All right. So, and then postmodernism, moving on to that, says fares no better than materialism. And I should have put just naturalism there, but their box has everything being a construct of the mind. So they looked at that and said, well, look, it's all interpretation. So individually, everything is relative, and then collectively, everything is a social construct. You might hear that a lot more now. It's a lot more popular to refer to things as social constructs. But this is only applied selectively, and we need to be on the lookout for when they try and smuggle in their own views that are exempted from the soup of relativism, because that happens all the time. I've got a quote a couple down there on the sheet that says, "Don't force your blank on me." Right? What is always put in that blank? Right? Don't force your views on me. Don't force your beliefs on me, your opinions on me, your values, your morality, your religion. You'll notice they never say, "Don't force your facts on me." And the reason for that is subconsciously, at least, they've developed that two-story thing, right? Religion and beliefs and values, that's all in the upper story, and that's fine if you have it for yourself, but just don't force that on me. Facts are in the lower story, and that's a completely separate thing. We all agree with that. Now, of course, as we'll learn more about next week, that's a self-refuting statement, because if you're telling me, don't force your beliefs on me, you are in fact telling me you're forcing a belief on me, right? And then, a response to that might be, well, hold on, who are you to tell me what I can and can't do? But that's something we'll get into next week. But this is an example of them trying to smuggle in their own view of, in this case, kind of pluralistic relativism of, well, as long as you keep your views private, that's fine. You go, hold on, that's your view. Didn't you just tell me that morality was a social construct and relative to the individual? Then why is it bad that I try and force my views on people? Yes? No, they don't. Yeah, you're entirely right. He said that non-believers and secularists have no problem forcing their views on us. And that's exactly it. They have this sort of a strategy to throw out forceful slogans, and most of the time it works, right? Most of the time you throw that out, hey, don't force your beliefs on me. And you just go, oh, well, yeah, okay. So we need a little bit of a loving backbone to kind of say, well, hold on a minute. That's your view that you're trying to push on me. Why should I just accept that? But you're exactly right. There's a quote there from a philosopher from last generation, Richard Rorty, who said, the suggestion that truth is out there is a legacy of an age in which the world was seen as the creation of a being who had a language of his own, a non-human language written in the cosmos. And I tried to, that relating to postmodernism, that truth is out there, objective from us, right? He's saying, well, that's a holdover from essentially Judeo-Christian worldviews. And there's a quote that I couldn't find. I don't remember who said it. It was a philosopher or a scientist that basically was talking about human rights as well and said, look, that's just a holdover, again, from kind of Judeo-Christian beliefs, and it has no place in our modern society. And that's a helpful kind of honesty, right? That, okay, truth is out there, holdover. Human rights, holdover. But of course, they have to live as if it's true in order to function in society, because you still want to look at your kids and your spouse and your friends and value them as people, protect them, honor them, not just treat them like machines that are biochemically determined that if a part goes bad, you swap it out and move in on that. But it's an inconsistency in their view. And yeah, you're gently pointing this out, like, hey, hold on, this doesn't fit with reality. And its reality is they themselves experience it, because we all have these sort of shared experiences, and they just don't think anything of it, but the worldview doesn't take it into account. So this is what Schaeffer called taking the roof off. He said, look, that people have constructed a house to protect themselves from the reality of God's creation. They've got the walls constructed of different beliefs, and the roof has different beliefs on it, and your job is to take the roof off and let them feel what is, right, God's truth and reality kind of pushing in on them. You don't need to be forceful. It'll be forceful enough on its own. And secularism and all its varieties does not provide a basis for the things that they themselves hold dear, and you're just gently pointing this out. Piercy says we should begin by expressing solidarity with their deepest longings for meaning and significance, and then show that in a biblical worldview, those longings are not merely illusions or useful fictions, but living realities. And this is where we have to know our Bibles, right? We have to know our own biblical worldview to be able to say, look, you value this. That you're right to value that, but it only makes sense to value that on the biblical worldview. Your view, whether that's atheism or postmodernism or whatever, doesn't really account for that, and mine does. Helpful in this is then Columbo Step 2. So that's from Greg Koukl's Tactics book. We talked about how Step 1 was being an investigator and essentially asking, what do you mean by that? So all of these steps are going to be just different questions. Learning how to ask questions and phrase questions is apologetic currency. So the better you develop that, the more well off you'll be. And this is reversing the burden of proof. Burden of proof is just a way of saying whoever makes a claim needs to give reasons for it. So we have the burden of proof as Christians. We're saying God exists, the Bible is reliable, Jesus is the only way to salvation, and any number of different claims, and we have to give reasons for that we'll talk about later in the class. But secular people have to give reasons for their beliefs too, and oftentimes they phrase them in such a way as attacks or just kind of strong statements, and it puts us as as humans, we get a little defensive. Well, now I have to come back and defend this and go at this. In reality, we do have to do that, but you can't let them have a free ride. They also have to provide views for why they think that's true. Essentially, just don't get caught with answering objections. Just you have to put the ball back in their court. And so the second Columbo question is, how did you come to that conclusion? Varieties of that. Why do you say that? What are your reasons for holding that view? What makes you think it happened that way? Why does that idea seem compelling to you? Or why do you feel that way? Because a lot of this stuff, the conversations I have with certain people might not be the type of conversations you have with certain people, but these principles and these questions are meant to kind of be broadly effective so that once you kind of get used to having some of this stick and get used to doing it, you can tailor these questions and discussions to the person you're talking to. And for example, super common, right? I don't go to church because the people there are hypocrites, right? Super common, right? And so the good example of the second Columbo question, why do you say that? Or can you give me a specific example of the hypocrisy you experienced? And then you can kind of come around to why is being a hypocrite off-putting or bad and wrong? Because the person making the charge of, well, I don't go there because there's hypocrites, more than likely is a naturalist or a postmodernist, right? So if they already believe that morality is either a useful fiction for functioning in society or a social construct, which you will have determined with your first Columbo question, right? You're trying to be an investigator, trying to figure out why they believe what they believe. And then if they bring this charge, say, okay, well, why is being a hypocrite bad? Hypocrite toward what? Now, it could be that there was a person that was a jerk and it just hurt them, and Christians are supposed to be nice, wonderful people, right? But this sort of question or this sort of attack, as Christians, we go, yeah, we are hypocrites, right? We know our own sin. We know our own tendencies. And so because we are soft-hearted towards sin, this question has a way of working with that to end the conversation, of being like, oh, yeah, you're right. And we don't want to talk about it. But in reality, you have to make sure they do at least their part of this conversation. Right? Our part might be something like, well, you're right. We are hypocrites a lot. But the church is where we can come as we are, and God can work on our sin. Right? We can work as a community to try and get more and more conformed to the image of Christ. But that only makes sense in a view in which objective morality, which is to say a morality not dependent on individuals or collections of people, the charge of hypocrisy only makes sense once our view is already true. So if you found out that this person is a relativist, you're going, well, why is hypocrisy a problem for you? Or if he's a naturalist, like, what does hypocrisy even mean? If we're all determined anyway, why are you making a moral judgment about it? Right? So you have to tailor your approach to the person you're talking to, but make sure they're doing their share of the lifting as well. And the second Columbo question trades on an important notion that an alternate explanation is not a refutation. In other words, if someone says, you're inviting them to church, right? And someone says, oh, well, yeah, you believe that. It's probably helpful to you as just sort of a comforting story you tell yourself because life's hard and eventually you're going to die, and that's a hard thing to face. And so if if that works for you, then that's great. That's not my thing. It doesn't matter. What they've done is not refuted Christianity. They've just put an explanation in its place. You believe that because. It's not a refutation, and it's subtle, right? But the second Columbo question is meant to expose that a little bit. Oh, okay, what did I say that makes you think I believe this because I'm afraid to die or whatever? What do you know about Christians and Christianity that would lead you to that conclusion? Or, oh well, the reason that people believe in Christianity is because they were a bunch of ignorant Bronze Age farmers, and they saw things like lightning, and they got scared and thought it was the gods that was angry, so they put this system of sacrifices in place to appease them and get more harvest for the grain or whatever. Again, that's not a refutation. It's just an explanation. It's a poor one and a common one, but it's just an explanation. And so at some point you have to be like, well, okay, I've got my Christian beliefs and you've got your alternative explanation. They're both on the table. You have to say which is more plausible. If you want another $2 word, this is abductive reasoning. It just means an inference to the best explanation. So you have your understanding, your explanation of why X. He has his explanation, which is the better explanation. And you both have to provide reasons for that. So it doesn't get you off the hook, but importantly, it doesn't get them off the hook either. And also, as Christians, we know that we justify our beliefs and our sins and our choices endlessly all the time, and it doesn't make it true. And so that's they're giving justifications of their suppression of the truth, right? And you can have endless variety of that, but we don't know anything about whether it's true or false based on an alternative explanation. And so when it comes to comparing, you've got internally, you're asking three things. Is it possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? So it could well be that I came to church today on the back of an ostrich. It's possible, right? They're big. Plausible? Not likely. Probable? Not at all. Easy to see when it comes with a silly example, but if someone says, I don't go to church because there's hypocrites in it, is it possible? Sure. Yeah. Is it plausible? We have to find out. How many times have they attempted to go to church? What examples are they giving for this, right? And then is it probable? Not usually. It's generally something like, I want to sleep in, church is early. Also, they say things that I find terrible. They're bigots. They're any list of whatever insult they have to say, right? They say I can't do X, Y, and Z, and I have to do X, Y, and Z. Don't want that. So it has very little to do with the hypocrisy of individuals in the church, and a lot more to do with their root problem. So, is there any questions on that? Yes. Right. Yeah, so he brought up the point of saying, well, if hypocrisy of the people in the organization is your objection, are you in any organization that doesn't have hypocrites in it? And if you're not, why is hypocrisy a problem with church but not with, the Y or whatever? And yeah, that's another way of ferreting out their actual problem with Christianity instead of this sort of quick phrase they've been taught to throw out to end conversation. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Anybody else? put Romans 1:20 down there. It said, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse." And I underlined that because I was thinking about it this week, and I was like, in a way, we know from this passage and others that they are without excuse. Right? God, both with the general revelation of nature and the special revelation of scriptures, the testimony of believers throughout time, people are without excuse, but oftentimes they don't know they're without excuse. And so apologetics, in a way, is letting them know that they're without excuse. You're tearing the roof off, right? You're gently, lovingly asking questions and kind of probing at their beliefs, because ultimately you want to show them you're without excuse. You're in a real problem here. Then you can move into evangelism. You have the bad news, and then here's the good news, right? So, in a way, you're trying to just get at that. You're trying to remove their excuses, because as a couple people have mentioned, a lot of this is just kind of a smokescreen to shut down conversation, to get from their real problem of, well, they're sinners and they rebel against God. They don't want any sort of divine authority over them for which they have to be accountable. And so we're kind of taking their excuses away from them. Oh, I totally forgot a quote earlier. That's from R.C. Sproul. Someone asked him, this was in one of those like Ligonier Conference panels, and someone asked him, well, what do you do when someone says, look, there is no right or wrong, true or false, all morality is relative. And in typical R.C. style, he just said, oh, so the person says there is no such thing as right and wrong, good or evil, true, false? Yeah. Well, you punch them and you take their wallet. I'm like, it's effective, right? Because we all know that there actually is. This is just a smokescreen. Now, I don't recommend punching someone and taking their wallet. But you could say, to use a question, for the sake of argument, what if I punched you and took your wallet? Would that be a problem? If I stole your car, if I took, would that be a problem? And it shows them, because they know that they don't want things. And if you're a relativist, all you can say is, well, maybe I don't prefer you happen to do that. But since there's nothing objectively right or wrong with it, be like, well, okay, that's a cute preference you have there, but I have a preference that I want your money, so I'm going to take it. So yeah, ultimately you're testing in any number of ways whether their beliefs match reality, and from the last couple weeks, you're already looking for things that don't fit in the box, things they're trying to explain away, and so you're then going, well, reality has that thing you're trying to throw away. How do you explain that? Because it's real in Christianity. And then pairing that with next week will be the coherence, because any worldview that's not the biblical worldview is going to be internally inconsistent. And you're also going to be able to kind of point that out and then say, look, Christianity is not. It's holistic, to use Piercy's term. We can explain the reality we see. We can explain the reality we experience individually, and it's all consistent. It all works together. So we have a holistic view of the truth, which, if you're a person, you're wanting that anyway, whether you do or don't self-consciously set out to make a system. You're wanting that so you can function as these guys talking about. So that is all I've got. Question? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure. So the question was, at what point do you realize the person you're talking to isn't actually interested in truth, isn't actually interested in what you believe or what they believe? They just kind of want to argue, right? At what point are you casting your pearls before swine? And that's a great question. It took me a long time to figure that out, I think mostly because I just wanted to argue too. Just kind of geared that way. For example, if you're online, don't argue, but if you do, be okay with them having the last word. It's a bigger step than you might think. If you present your belief and you're trying to do it lovingly, you're not being a jerk, you do it winsomely as much as you can, and they're still just wanting to go to town, let them have the last word. Because ultimately, online discussion is similar to like a public debate in that most of the time you're not going to be winning the person you're discussing with, but there are creepers who are looking and following, and you're wanting to, you're looking for them. You're wanting to influence people who won't say anything in the discussion but are reading it. So you're wanting to be when someone, you let them have the last word. In person, you've kind of got to flesh that out on a case-by-case basis. If they keep, for example, I was having a discussion with a guy who would just keep throwing out stuff, and it's just not even, okay, you've answered that objection, but here's another one. It's not even that, but it was just, well, what about this word? And they debate this and this and this and this and this. And I said, all right, so here's the thing. What happens if I were to answer every objection you have? What would you do? If hypothetically, if I could, for the sake of argument, answer all of your objections, would you then bow the knee to Christ? And if they say no, well, then they're not interested in it, right? Say, well, okay, I appreciate your time. Thank you for this has been helpful to me. But if you're not actually interested in truth, I can't keep going around and around and around with you, because ultimately I'm not seeking to win arguments. I'm hoping that you will be saved from the wrath of God. So that can be helpful, because even if you don't have an answer to their objections, you can phrase that, you can throw that question out there, because you can always say, look, that's a great issue, it's a great question. I don't have an answer for that right now. I can go do my homework, I can talk to people who do, I know where to find the answers, and I can come back and we can talk about this. And if I have an answer for that, what would your response be? And that's kind of an awkward thing to do, because in the middle of the debate, you're like, yeah, this is like fencing, right? You're in the middle of it. But if you're honest, because as Christians, we want to see people saved, not just win arguments, right? So that's kind of how I would do that. If you're starting to see, if you're answering a couple objections and you're going around with them, and they don't seem to be interested, they're not asking questions about truth, they're not asking about the gospel or God, they're just kind of throwing out endless series of objections, you do have to be okay with being like, okay, well, thanks, but politely you just want to say, well, I guess we have nowhere to go if you're not actually interested in the real meat here. So thanks. Anybody else have a question? No? All right. I will go ahead and close this. Heavenly Father, thank you for being a God who has created us to understand the world. Thank you for giving us your truth as a means of understanding ourselves and understanding our relationship with you. Thank you for sending your Son to be able to reconcile your people. We couldn't do it on our own, and we couldn't think our way to you. We couldn't work our way to you, but you provided the only way in Jesus Christ. I thank you that we have great Christian leaders and witnesses throughout history and today to be able to help us give reasons for the hope that we have and to be able to navigate discussions. And I pray that as we seek to share the gospel, that some of this will stick and help us point the way to the cross. And I pray that we would continue to think and live and act for your glory and ultimately for the salvation of people. I pray for the service this morning that your truth would be heard clearly and convincingly, and that your people would hear exactly what you want them to hear, and that our minds would be alert and focused on it, and our hearts would be opened and ready to receive your truth, and that we would be able to have our lives affected by what we hear, and ultimately that we would be able to better reflect the image of Jesus to the watching world. In Jesus' name.